Good morning, everybody. I'm going to call the July 25th meeting of the Board of Education to order. I'm starting off the meeting because we will have our election for the president of the board here in a moment. But first, let's start with a moment of silence followed by the Pledge of Allegiance. And please stand for the pledge.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay. The first item on the agenda is the election of the president of the board. Do we have any nominations for the board? Or from the board? Yes.
I would like to place the name of Dan Gecker for nomination. Dan I'm excited that he has been reappointed, number one. And number two, I think for the last 2 years, he has led us very strongly. We have a comprehensive plan that I think all of us are very excited about, and we have been working hard. He has been leading us in that work, and I really think that it would be wonderful if he would continue to lead us till we really get more done in that regard. So I place his name in nomination.
Great. We have a nomination for Mr. Gecker. Is there a second?
I will second that nomination.
Okay. The floor is still open for any other nominations. Are there other nominations from the board? Okay. We have a nomination for Mr. Gecker. And at this time, we'll take a vote of the board. All in favor of electing Mr. Dan Gecker as president of the board for 2019-2020, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right. And it carries. And Mr. Gecker, congratulations, Mr. President.
Thank you. You know, I certainly do appreciate not being voted off the island, as they say, and, or blindsided here this morning. So thanks to everybody. We do look forward to continuing the work as set out in the comprehensive plan, and look forward to another couple good years. Next order of business is the election of a vice president. Are there any nominations?
Mr. Gecker.
Yes, ma'am.
It's my pleasure to nominate Mrs. Diane Atkinson to serve in the role of Vice President of the Board of Education for 2019-21, actually. Mrs. Atkinson, similarly to you, has been central to the work that we have done as a board, particularly around the creation and adoption of the standards of accreditation. And so we are certainly appreciative of all of her work and guidance and look forward to continued leadership in the role of Vice President if she chooses to accept this nomination.
Okay.
I second.
Thank you. Any other nominations? There's no surprises from, okay. All those in favor then of electing Ms. Atkinson as Vice President of the Board, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? I will say, furthering those comments, that the last 2 years, I think we've been a strong team, being able to, work together. People often don't see the meetings that occur between the meetings, but Diane has been willing to, and make time to meet frequently to discuss the business of the board and to move the work of the board forward. And it's been really a great partnership in my view. So thank you for agreeing to come back.
Thank you to the board for electing me as vice president. I so enjoy this work. I am excited about where we're headed, and I look forward to working with you for another year.
And the only reason you say another year is because of the term limit, just to be clear.
That would be true.
Okay. It's not that only one of the 2 years would be good. All right, moving down the agenda. I hope you have had a chance to review the minutes of June 19 and 20 of 2019. If so, is there a motion to either adopt those minutes or to recommend changes? The minutes, great, thank you. Is there a second? Second from Dr. Pexton. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. One abstention. That carries. Before we do public comment, let me first introduce Pam Davis-Vaught, newest member of the board. Congratulations. We look forward to working with you. We had a full day of work yesterday, and I don't know if you would like to take this chance, because they made me do this when I joined the board, to, just give, say hello and give a brief background. You don't have to, but it does seem to be the hazing tradition, so.
Good morning. Thank you, President Gecker, and thank you all for having me here with you at the board. I am from Bristol, Virginia. I am the principal of a small elementary school called Highland View Elementary, and very passionate about children in impoverished communities and in challenged schools, and look forward to adding to the discussions and to my role here with the board.
Great, thank you. We were so excited to have Pam with us yesterday that we actually held a meeting with her sitting in before she was sworn in. She had been nominated or appointed by the governor, but the actual oath had not yet been administered, and that occurred in our morning executive session. Because we took votes that way, we're going to go back now. We're going to add this item to the agenda, and we're going to re-vote on yesterday's licensure cases. Yes, ma'am.
The only question I have is when we take votes on numbers, because they collected everything, and I'm
Yes.
going to be basing that off of including my.
There's only one of them that's two of them that are numbers, and I hope you will remember them.
Okay, sorry. I guess I was just kind of I went back to grab at least the agenda, and I'd already turned it all in. Okay.
Well, we're going to try to cure this. We've discussed this with the AG's office, and this is, the process now. So in case one, which will actually have two motions associated with it, if that helps you. First, the chair will entertain a motion to issue a license reinstatement with the following endorsements: emotional disturbance K-12 and specific learning disabilities K-12. That's for case one. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Duran and Ms. Atkinson. We do this by roll call. Dr. Duran?
Aye.
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 Okay, thank you. I will entertain a motion to deny an endorsement in administration and supervision to Yvette Amberette Disno.
So moved. Second.
Thank you. Dr. Duran?
Aye.
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 Okay. Entertain a motion to suspend the license of Eve Minter through July 31st, 2020.
So moved.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Duran?
No. Aye.
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 Okay. Entertain a motion to revoke the license of Robin Manning Skidmore.
So moved.
Thank you. Is there a second? Thank you. Dr. Duran?
Aye.
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 Thank you. Entertain a motion to revoke the license of Robert Keith Rowe.
So moved.
Thank you. Is there a second? Thank you. Dr. Duran?
Aye.
Yeah. Aye.
Aye.
And finally, entertain a motion to issue a license, extension of provisional license in case number 6.
Second.
Okay, Dr. Duran?
Aye.
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 Okay, thank you. That covers the discipline cases from yesterday. So we will move on to public comment. We have a number of speakers signed up. Sean Campbell. I think everybody knows what we do here. We allow 3 minutes per speaker. It is the practice of this board not to respond to speakers individually. However, staff does track all comments, and to the extent a response is necessary, staff will be in touch with a response. Good morning.
Hi, good morning, and congratulations.
Thank you, sir.
Good morning, newly elected President Gecker, the members of the board, and Dr. Lane. My name's Sean Campbell. I'm from Powhatan, Virginia. I just want to take a moment to talk briefly about the regulations governing the use of restraint seclusion in public schools, particularly about prone restraints and just prone restraints. Last month, Dr. Hollins talked to you all about why prone restraints were removed from the proposed regulations. In her comment, she said that the language regarding the banned methods of restraint were broadened to capture all forms of restraint that restricts breathing and are otherwise dangerous. And on the surface, that sounds great. But I did a little bit of digging. And back in February 2017, I discovered that not all VDOE staff share that perspective. If you look on the back page of the sheet that I've passed out to you, I like to play what this other staff member had to say.
Decision point 5. In our initial draft, we proposed to prohibit prone and supine restraints. These tend to be the forms of restraints that have caused harm to students, where students' breathing is restricted. We've had some school representatives and some training organizations push back on that a little bit to say that sometimes there are prone restraints that are necessary, supine restraints that are necessary. And if you're properly trained, that should not be a problem because you're not restricting the airway.
I find that public comment very disturbing because given that mentality, this is the person who's responsible for the oversight of following these proposed regulations. And if she believes that prone restraints can be done properly and that prone restraints are sometimes necessary, then the verbiage that you all have proposed in these current regs would create a loophole, which would allow prone restraints, if done properly, to be used in public schools. And so what I'd like you all to really consider and really think about is putting a very explicit prohibition on prone restraints to protect our students and to make sure that it's clear, the message is clear to all VDOE staff. And I just want to thank you all. I know this has been a long process. I've been a part of this process since Delegate Hope introduced the original bill back in, I think it was 2014, to do a study or a review on the current policies and practices on this. And really thank you. I know it's been a long process. And thank you. And I'm hopeful that you guys will do the right thing. And thanks.
Thank you. Alex Campbell.
Good morning. My name is Alexander Campbell. I'm 13 years old and I have autism, and I'm an advocate for individuals with disabilities. When I was in elementary school, I was subjected to restraint and seclusion. When I was 7 years old, my principal would literally drag me out of the timeout area and into the seclusion room. After being shoved into the seclusion room, the principal would slam the door shut and pull a large wooden desk across the door so I could not leave. I remember hearing the scraping sound of the desk as it moved across the door, knowing that I was there alone. The seclusion room itself was a converted storage closet with walls painted black, and it had a barred window. Not only did the principal put me in the seclusion room, he told me that if I ever told my parents, he would lock me in the room every day. These rooms are dark and scary for children. In your packets, there is a picture of a Fairfax County Public Schools seclusion room that is located inside of an elementary school. You will also notice there's a superhero on the wall inside of the seclusion room. I guess Fairfax tries to give some encouragement to the children they lock inside their seclusion rooms while their administrators are busy telling the Department of Education that they have 0 instances of restraint and seclusion. At a different school, I was subjected to a restraint that sent me to the hospital. One of the pictures taken by the forensic nurse at the hospital is included in your packets. The teacher used a restraint that involved grabbing me by the throat and slamming me on the floor. She kept slamming me on the floor until I couldn't stand up anymore. Even individuals that train people on how to perform restraints will admit that this was not a restraint. This was a pure act of physical violence in order to assert dominance and authority. The school later admitted that she was improperly trained. The school was placed on an improvement plan by the state, but nothing happened to the teacher. Instead, the school moved the teacher to a nonverbal classroom so she could repeat the same behaviors and no one would have a voice to stand up for themselves. I would like to express extreme disappointment in the VDOE staff, VDOE board, State Superintendent Dr. James Lane, and past State Superintendent Dr. Stephen Staples. When the Virginia Department of Education wants something to be done, the same process takes 4 months. It has taken you all 4 years to do your jobs and go through with this process. It has taken visit after visit to an elected official just so an elected official can call somebody and tell you and your staff to do your jobs. And that's why I asked the question, do grown adults really need to be babysat at work by elected officials? By sitting here and doing nothing, you all are failing over 1 million students. Those are the people you're supposed to represent. Instead, many of you continue to represent lobbying organizations such as the Virginia Education Association. Teachers are legally given plenty of protections. The teachers who pay large sums of fees to join the VEA and the teachers who fear for their jobs and being sued because of their mistakes. If teachers feel scared or worried, then they must be very horrible at their jobs. But let's talk about teachers' rights for a moment. Grafton School almost eliminated restraint and fully eliminated seclusion. They found that by using de-escalation strategies, staff members were no longer getting injured and they saved millions of dollars. VEA misrepresents teachers and students. It is clear that these organizations simply do not care about anyone. Last meeting, their lobbyists couldn't even listen to people share their experiences, and instead she knitted the whole time. I am also disappointed in the board for failing to follow their vision statement. It clearly states that you all want students to be in a safe and healthy learning environment. There is a copy of your vision statement in your packet. If you do not want to follow it, you know where the door is and nobody is stopping you from leaving. So please stand up for students and do what is right. I would also like to express disappointment in members of the board and Dr. James Lane for not condemning the use of restraint in public schools. Mrs. Holton was the only board member who said anything publicly about the issue. In a tweet on March 21st, she stated, "We will do better." That tweet is attached in your packets. It is shameful that you all have not said anything publicly about the issue. Governor Northam, Governor McAuliffe, 42 members of the Congress, almost all of the General Assembly, and Secretary DeVos have all condemned restraint and seclusion in our schools, yet only one of you have. Dr. Lane, taxpayers are paying you $235,000 a year, and you haven't said anything about this type of abuse in our school system. If you cannot speak up for children in schools, then what are we paying you for? To smile for the camera. I can almost guarantee you make more than anybody behind me, and they have advocated and stuck up for kids more than you have. Another board member approached me at the end of the meeting and told me, "I'm fighting for you. I really am." And a lot of people on this board are not. She then told me how she was a teacher for many years and how she understands. This is the issue here. A lot of you weren't teachers and don't have the necessary experience in a classroom. I would also like to express extreme disappointment in your staff's comment about prone restraint. How many of you have actually been in a prone restraint by a show of hands? Well, I have. And let me tell you, when a staff member says it doesn't restrict breathing, she's lying. It does, because the position you're in blocks your chest from compressing, and that causes you to become more active, which uses up more oxygen. Not only does it cause physical harm, but after you've been through that, you do not want to learn because you do not trust your teachers and you do not feel like you're in a safe and healthy learning environment. 4 verbal students have died in prone restraint, and their last words were, "I can't breathe." What about the 16 other prone restraint deaths the GAO documented in 2009? The nonverbal children who can't advocate for themselves and who can't say, "I can't breathe." Prone restraints kill people literally. Please don't let another child die because you and your staff cannot do your jobs. Many of you are mothers and fathers. What do you plan on saying when your child comes home and says they got restrained or secluded at school? And I really hope it doesn't happen to you, and I hope it doesn't happen to any parent in here, but what do you plan on saying when you get a phone call that your child is dead because a staff member several times their size sat on them? What do you plan on saying when you're standing over your child's grave who died from restraint? "Sorry that I can't do my job" would be a great answer. It is clear that VDOE's message by not banning prone restraint is that they want your children to die. The message to the people behind me and parents across the state is that Mr. Gecker, Dr. Lane, and members of the board and VDOE staff want your children to die, and they simply do not care. I would also like to express disappointment in VDOE staff, members of the board, and Dr. Lane for allowing discrimination to take place towards African American students and students with disabilities. What truly disappoints and confuses me is that most about this issue is that several members of the board are African American themselves. Black students only represent 19% of students with disabilities, but they represent 36% of students put into mechanical restraints. Students with disabilities represent 12% of all students, yet they represent 75% of the students who are restrained and 58% of the students who are secluded. Those numbers came from the Department of Education. I have attached the pages from their study in your packets. This is pure racial and disability status discrimination. In these past 4 years, you all have been allowing it, and the majority of you are supporting it. You all may feel like I have kind of abused you today. I want you to know that how you all are being treated does not compare to the children who are being locked in closets and sat on. At one school less than 15 minutes away from here, 7,000 students have been restrained and secluded since 2016. That is just one school. If we want to talk about all private schools in Virginia, the same data shows 27,514 restraints and seclusion since 2016. And I emailed you all that study to your board email last night because it was fairly long. These are just private day schools. I'm not including Fairfax's thousands and other public school districts. That is a lot of times children are being abused because of you all not taking action. These numbers do not have to continue. Everything I discussed no longer has to be the issue. We can stand up and advocate for children, and I ask you all to please do the right thing. Thank you.
Thank you. Cornelia Long. Good morning.
2 pages, but the same documents. Okay. Good morning. My name is Cornelia Hawkins Long. I'm an ASHA certified speech language pathologist, which means I am able to practice throughout the country. Greetings, Virginia Department of Education, President and Board. Did you know that 8 to 9% of young children suffer from a speech sound disorder? Did you also know that the second most common reason for special education services in public schools is speech language impairment? And that is according to a 2017-2018 study comprised by the National Center for Education and Statistics, and you are receiving some information in this regard. Currently, speech language pathologists throughout the Commonwealth operate on a caseload maximum of 68. This law was enacted in the General Assembly in 1975. That was over 43 years ago. Many of us were not even born at that time. That's a small joke, but it was a long time ago. And so I'd like to call to the board's attention that serving 68 students as a speech pathologist is akin to running a marathon with a 20-pound backpack. It's not impossible, but it is cumbersome and quite difficult. And for 43 years, dedicated speech pathologists in the Commonwealth, we've made it happen, but it's been difficult. And so we'd like the board to consider a workload approach and the next standards of quality when a review comes up. Because our neighbors in the South, North Carolina, have a caseload cap of 60. And our neighbors to the west in West Virginia carry a caseload maximum of 50.
while we are funded for 68. Again, this was an act that was implemented 43 years ago. It's time to revisit this particular caseload maximum. And why do we want to reduce the caseload maximum? Simple. By reducing caseloads, we ensure increased individualized instruction. That means we can see more children on a one-on-one basis, which means they'll get out of special education even faster. By doing this, we can ensure that the reach of speech pathologists can reach all children and minimize or eradicate delays and disabilities. And last, by reducing caseloads, we ensure that we can attract the best and the brightest speech pathologists to the Commonwealth in our schools. Our children deserve the best and the brightest. We ask for each of you to join the conversations about how speech pathologists can take our practices from good to great. While I say we have been doing what we needed to do for over 43 years, but it's time for us to go from great to excellent. In closing, as an educator, my hope is to provide hope and light to all children. But as a great educator, my hope is to provide opportunities for greatness, optimism, and success for all children. Thank you for this space.
Thank you. Okay, Beth Tolley.
Had a root canal on Tuesday. I don't know how my voice is going to hold up. Alex, I share your concerns. Thank you for being so eloquent. It was beyond disappointing to me to open the June report summarizing the review of the public comments and see that out of 46 requests for banning seclusion and 40 requests for banning restraints and for an additional 21 for banning prone restraints, that all of the response to all of those was no change recommended. I couldn't figure this out because I know DOE values public input and parent-professional partnership. So I couldn't understand how, and DOE heard these heartfelt comments at the March meeting. It just floored me. So I struggled with this and I searched for understanding, and I came across policy on the PBIS webpage that pretty much mirrored the regulations that Virginia is endorsing. And as I continued to search on the PBIS, which is the Positive Behavior and Intervention Supports, the national website, I began to get an understanding of what's going on. PBIS says that educators must understand that behavior is a form of communication and that all behavior serves a function. Students use their behavior to communicate that they want to get something or to avoid something. Well, Mona Delahook, who is a psychologist, writes in her blog, Childhood Trauma, Understanding Behavior Challenges, that far from being intentional, children's behaviors, children who've had trauma, which is up to 40% of our population, at least 40%, their behaviors are reactions to complex brain-body connections. According to neuroscientists such as Stephen Porges and Bruce Perry, humans build emotional and behavior control through experiences in relationships. When we choose to punish a child's behavior challenges secondary to trauma, we are acting in conflict with what we know about brain development. This applies also to kids with neurodevelopment, like kids with autism, kids with ADHD, kids with anxiety. Instead, we need to integrate neuroscience principles into our approaches for traumatized children and kids with neurodiversity who display challenging behaviors. Too many children are suffering, and the popular strategies to simply trying to alter their behaviors fails to acknowledge the importance of loving engagement with adults as the foundation of treatment. David Armstrong's article addressing the wicked problem of behavior in school in the International Journal of Inclusive Education, which was published in April, states that since the 1990s, I left out a part. PBIS has been used in the schools. That's 3 decades, 2 decades, 2.5. But it doesn't seem to have made a difference in our suspensions and expulsions and seclusions. And what happens is that kids with disabilities and mental health, and we also know kids of color, have been facing disadvantages as a result of the application of this model. Armstrong recommends wholehearted rejection of the manage and discipline model. And he argues for educational practices to align with insight from human behavior arising from research in developmental psychology. In closing, I ask you to read, I have in there a couple hyperlinks. Read an article from an educator who had 20 years in education, and then she adopted a child who had complex trauma, and her eyes were opened to the difference when you look at research outside the educational field, research in trauma, behavior science, brain science, and see the difference. Thank you.
Teresa Champion.
Good morning, members of the board. My name is Teresa Champion. I am a member of the Virginia Autism Project and the parent of an adult son who was restrained and secluded in Fairfax County Public Schools and in private school. I had the opportunity to hear a lot of your passions and what brought you to this position. And you talked about equity. And you talked about adults' education and preparing them for the workforce. You talked about early intervention. Well, I think all of those things you bring to this board position need to be applied to what you're facing today. And I'm addressing the regulations on restraint and seclusion that you are considering. What can I say that hasn't been said more eloquently than Alex and his father, or even Beth, and in your executive summary, you talk about all of the public comments that you heard on this topic. I think your staff does you a disservice when they say in the executive summary, I think it was on the first page, stakeholders held sharply divided views on the proposed regulations. No one supported prone restraint, to my knowledge. So what can I say that hasn't been said? Well, as I've been called, I'm just a mom. And I am here to advocate because you've heard the legal arguments for banning restraint seclusion of disabled students. You've heard that it violates the Americans with Disabilities Act. You've heard that it prevents children from having FAPE, a free and appropriate public education. You've heard that it violates the Constitution, 4th and 14th Amendment. You've heard that it violates Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. You've heard that it violates 42 USC 1983. You've heard that it violates Virginia state law. Corporal punishment on students with disabilities violates all of those laws. Yet you're considering regulations that will allow that. You've heard from adults who are restrained, self-advocates who have a voice and have used it so meaningfully. And I thank them because I have a son who can't. You've heard personal testimony. You've heard you've had and reviewed written comments. Parents are caring for children with disabilities for the rest of their natural lives. They are also caring now for children who have been traumatized by unlawful restraint and seclusion. As I often say, I'm going to be working until noon of the day I die because I can't take vacations. I can't take these opportunities to have a break. And many families cannot be here today to tell their stories because of that very reason. They can't be here to tell their reality, but I'm going to try because I can talk to you about the fear that children, and you've heard it, the fear that children experience and that they don't understand. And I gave you an example of someone in and I don't know if you remember, but I'm in an IEP meeting. And I think I am being forceful in my opinions and stating them emphatically. And I pound on the table and I get loud with my voice and the papers fall off the table. And everyone there in the room feels threatened by me. And they jump up and they grab me and hold me down and call for help and say, come get her. Let's put her in a room so she can calm down. Well, I think I've just been giving my opinion in an emphatic manner. I've used my behavior to communicate, but you all interpreted it differently. So does that mean that these children should be abused and traumatized? No. If you can't find enough speech therapists for the state, then why the hell are you punishing children who use behavior as communication because you haven't given them enough speech therapists to teach them how to communicate? Okay. We're punishing children for our inabilities to do our job. Does that make sense? No. So you recognize ACEs, which are traumatic events in a child and a family's experience outside of the school. Well, this is an ACE that occurs within the school, and it needs to be called that. These children who have suffered this trauma can't go to the bathroom and shut the door. That's a small space. Have nightmares, are fearful of others. Now, we as parents care for children, and this happened to me. I did not understand why my son did not want to go to school. He did not want to get on that bus. He was angry. He would attack us. He fought. He ran for his life away from that bus. We just didn't understand it because we weren't told what was going on at school, and he could not tell us. He was angry at us. We forced him to go on a bus to go to a place where he would be locked in a room and held down in a prone restraint. When we finally found out about it, it was like a couple-hour prone restraint. So the law requires me to send him to school. If I don't, then I'm charged with truancy and contributing to delinquency of a minor. So here I am in a catch-22. I'm sending a child to a place where he's going to be abused. And if I don't, I'm going to be charged with a crime. That's a misdemeanor. So I'm disappointed at the false statements made by your staff. No one has supported restraint seclusion of disabled children. Disabled children have medical conditions. We have to stop treating these children as a behavior disorder. Prone restraints and seclusion of children with disabilities must stop. Stop punishing children for the inability of adults to do their job. Thank you.
Jim Livingston.
Good morning, President Gecker, members of the board, Dr. Lane. My name is Jim Livingston. I am proud to stand before you as president of the Virginia Education Association, representing nearly 40,000 education professionals across the Commonwealth. The VEA is grateful to the Board of Education for your work on the proposed revisions to the standards of quality and your consideration of the language the VEA submitted to you on these proposals. As you know, the VEA believes that the current SOQs do not reflect the true needs of our students and our public schools. So we applaud your efforts to make very specific revisions that address some of our concerns. I want to first address the 4 revisions the SOQ committee discussed yesterday. The VEA fully supports these additions. It is well past time for both the reading intervention programs and class size reduction programs to not only be expanded, but to be included in the SOQs. Thank you for those proposals. The VEA has worked closely with the broader education community to address the need to offer more support to our school principals. In fact, the VEA has included high-quality principal mentorship programs in our recommendations to address the teacher shortage. We know that well-trained, supportive instructional leaders are one of the keys to addressing teacher turnover and student achievement. We fully support the addition of the principal mentorship program into the SOQs. The VEA also supports the new proposal that would establish a unit in the Department of Education to cultivate business partnerships to provide work-based learning opportunities for our students. We know that with a high school redesign, our public schools need this leadership and support from the department. I also want to take this opportunity to applaud the addition of the requirement in the student support proposal that health and behavioral specialists be licensed. As you know, the VEA supported the 2016 SOQ revisions that gave each category of support their own ratio. And we also continue to support a registered nurse in each of our public schools. We ask that you please consider our recommendations on that proposal. As we submitted to you, the VEA believes that the intent of the board to address teacher quality in high-need schools can be more effectively met by targeting specific teacher supports to high-poverty schools and by allowing school divisions the flexibility to use the additional at-risk add-on funding for compensation incentives for teachers. The VEA continues to oppose the targeted compensation adjustment proposal for all the reasons I have stated here and in previous comments. The VEA asks that you consider the language we submitted as it related to these revisions and striking the targeted compensation adjustment proposal. I want to express my appreciation the effort this board has made to seek our input on these revisions. The VEA, as I have stated, represents nearly 40,000 education professionals across the Commonwealth. We have sought feedback from our members from all over the Commonwealth of Virginia. Today, I ask that you please review the language that we have submitted on behalf of our membership. Thank you, and I wish you a good day.
Thank you. Okay. That covers everybody who has signed up. Is there anybody here who has not signed up to speak who would like to speak today? I don't see anybody coming forward. We'll close public comment. Thanks to everybody who spoke. All right, we'll move on to the consent agenda. Items A through F. Is there anybody who'd like to move anything from the consent agenda? If not, is there a motion to approve the consent agenda as drafted or as set forth?
So moved, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson. Thank you, Dr. Paxton, for the second. All those in favor of approval of the consent agenda signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Any abstentions? All right, that carries. Okay, we'll move on to item G. Final review of proposed regulations governing the use of seclusion and restraint in public elementary and secondary schools in Virginia, final stage.
Good morning, President Gecker, board members, and Dr. Lane. I'm Sam Hollins, the Assistant Superintendent for Special Education and Student Services for the Virginia Department of Education. I'm here today to present for your final review the proposed regulations governing the use of seclusion and restraint in public schools, both elementary and secondary in Virginia. Virginia Code was enacted by the Virginia General Assembly in 2014, requiring that the Virginia Board adopt regulations on the use of seclusion and restraint in public and elementary and secondary schools in the Commonwealth that are consistent with its guidelines for the development of policies and procedures for managing student behavior in emergency situations and the 15 principles contained within the U.S. Department of Education's Restraint and Seclusion Resources document. The Virginia Department of Education sought extensive stakeholder input, involving at least 5 separate meetings prior to drafting the proposed regulations, and received extensive public comment. Stakeholders held sharply divided views on the proposed regulations, and as a result, the board considered the proposed regulations at length in 5 meetings and a board work session. Final review was completed on March 23rd, 2017, and the board has also subscribed to an initial final review at its meeting in June. Important to note that in 2019, the Virginia General Assembly passed House Bill 2599, requiring the board to specifically identify and prohibit the use of any method of restraint or seclusion that it determined poses a significant danger to the student, and establish safety standards for seclusion. VDOE staff believes that the proposed regulations currently express the board's determination in these manners. I want to take a moment to address a couple of issues that were brought to my attention. One are any of the substantial edits that have been made since your previous review. You'll note 2 of them. One, an application, Section A, that exempts detention homes or any facility that is operated by the Virginia Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Services from these regulations, as they do not fall under the purview of elementary and secondary schools, but at times they do serve the need of students who are also currently enrolled in local education agencies. The second change is in the definitions section under student, which does not include individuals receiving instruction in secure facilities or detention homes or in a facility that is operated by the Department of Health and Developmental Services. This is important to note because both of those state agencies also hold their own regulations governing the use of seclusion and restraint, in their programs. So to do so here again would be duplicative. I also want to take a moment and comment on the specific wording around prone restraint. Although a great many local school division programs would be unaffected by a ban on prone restraints, the same could not be said for programs that operate within the public school system. Being prohibited from using carefully designed and trained emergency procedures that allow them to provide support to individuals with significant behavioral support needs could affect them adversely. I have a couple of pieces of information that I want to share with you. One are some points from the Restraint Reduction Network. It's often cited that there is a need to ban prone restraint because it causes positional asphyxia, which is a multifaceted tenet with body position being one of the range of causative factors. Restraint-related deaths have occurred in standing, seated, and supine positions. There is an additional concern whether or not any form of manual restraint that compresses the chest compromises breathing, along with multiple additional risk factors. The department is of a mind that staff should plan interventions around the specific needs of students, taking into account any risk factors that might place the students in a more vulnerable position. As with any emergency procedure, staff should be competent in the use of manual restraint in a way that provides for the safety and dignity in students, as noted in the proposed regulations. We also have school divisions and some of our regional programs that are currently utilizing training vendors such as Handle with Care that adopt the primary restraint technique, or PRT, which is the only physical restraint or method ever granted a patent in U.S. history, in the U.S. Patent Office history, for its safeguards to prevent chest compression and the possibility of positional asphyxiation. The tripod modification is a weight-bearing bridge that enables staff to perform a safe prone floor hold without placing any weight on an individual's back or chest. This program is used by regional programs in the Commonwealth of Virginia who are currently working in collaboration with the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights. There's also additional data and empirical evidence to suggest from a collection of information called the Premature Call for a Ban on Prone Restraint that a misconception that all prone holding causes chest compression or cardiac issues. It is the status of the department staff to make sure that the board is provided with as much information as possible, empirical evidence that cites multiple sources of information along with data and research, that it's premature to ban an entire category of procedures that share only a generic descriptor, when incidents fall into three main categories. One, evidence of the implementation of a poorly designed procedure, vague descriptions of improvised holds, or a lack of information about the hold, except for a face-up or face-down distinction. The proposed regulations in front of you address, through the use of only evidence-based practices and training curriculum that is designed to inform staff, many of the issues that have happened that have caused student injury have involved instances that proposed regulations do not involve an adopted crisis-based training manual. It is the view of staff that allowing school divisions and enforcing the adoption of a crisis management system that is evidence-based and requires a staff training component for all staff who may come into contact with students would be beneficial to increase the safety and security of students and staff. While this discussion is not specifically centered around supine positions, there is no empirical evidence to suggest that supine holding is safer than prone holding. Research from the Journal of Clinical Outcomes Management found that more injuries occurred to both staff and students in a supine position than in a prone position. A complete ban on prone holding can easily end up doing more harm than good because it will remove valuable tools from the hands of trained and qualified teachers. Such a ban could increase the risk of injury for a group of students who may have otherwise been manageable, allowing them to remain in a more inclusive and less restrictive environment. At this point, the recommendation of the superintendent for public instruction is that the board adopt the regulations governing the use of seclusion and restraint in public and elementary secondary schools in Virginia in their final stage. I'm happy to answer any questions or concern that the board may have.
Are there any questions, or is the board ready to discuss this?
I do have a
Yeah, please, Dr. Wilson.
question. Thank you, and good morning. You mentioned just this morning the Handle with Care, and that there are a number of divisions that are involved in learning techniques from that particular vendor. Do you have a number of how many divisions currently and/or prospectively are even actively thinking about that. And the reason I asked the question is trying to get a sense of scale. And are there other vendors as well?
There are multiple other vendors, and there is a really wide representation of how those vendors are being utilized across the Commonwealth. Handle with Care is one that we see large representation from a regional collection of school divisions in the Tidewater area, as well as some of our smaller divisions. While I don't have distinct numbers, that is part of the information and data collection that we'll be collecting in order to follow through on the fiscal requirements of these regulations being put into place.
And did I hear you also say that this is one that the U.S. Department of Education is involved with or considering?
That is correct. So one of our regional programs is currently working in tandem with the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights in a way to review proactively their processes and procedures around restraint and seclusion. As the board is aware, most of our local school divisions have guidance and/or policy related to this issue. Oftentimes, the state coming in behind provides an additional context for that. But yes, in this example, we have a regional program that serves multiple school divisions that is seeking proactively to define their work around this issue, and Handle with Care is the vendor that they use.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Ms. Atkins.
Yes. Thank you for the additional background regarding the department's recommendation to move forward. But just from looking at the information provided on page 14, where it gets to prohibited actions, the use of mechanical restraints, very general in nature, and then moving on to point 4, where it says the use of restraint or inclusion in any manner that restricts a student's breathing or harms a student. Why isn't it reasonable to add such as but not limited to prone restraints? Because I just think that's a very reasonable consideration for the department.
So, Ms. Atkins, I won't comment on the reasonableness of the board's actions, but what I will tell you is that we do have certified training vendors currently that are working within Virginia school divisions that are providing training that involves prone restraints that do not restrict student breathing. And that's why the department feels that this language is inclusive of not only prone restraints, but other restraints that could restrict a student's breathing. In other words, there is a lot of information this research in the field is developing very rapidly. We feel that this language is inclusive of anything that could be detrimental to a student's safety, while also encompassing the fact that there are research-based practices and evidence, empirically and otherwise, to suggest that there are safe holds that could utilize the prone position.
Ms. Atkinson.
You keep referring to training, so tell me, I want to understand the breadth to which training is occurring in our divisions. I want to understand whether, you're talking about Handle with Care, and I think it's a sort of an add-on to Dr. Wilson's question. I want to have a better understanding that if we were to retain this current language, that as to how many of our divisions would have teachers that are appropriately trained?
So that's a great question. So as you'll note in the proposed regulations, as well as our guidance document that the department has previously published and worked on, is that there is a focus for responding to student behavior in a positive way. And many of our public commenters and many of the information within your executive summary contains background on positive behavior interventions and supports, and on building upon positive reactions to building that communicative skill in students. So many of our divisions work within our Virginia Tiered Systems of Support framework to include the use of those positive behavioral interventions and supports. And as you can see from the proposed regulations, that would continue to be a requirement. So you would think of that as kind of your tier 1 instruction, right? Every staff that comes into contact with students should be reacting in a PBIS framework, a focus on social emotional learning, and equipping students with the skills in order for them to be successful both inside and outside of school. As we progress through the level of interventions for students with significant behavior challenges, of which I want to iterate, this is a very small population of students. And we've heard many folks talk about students with disabilities. It's a very small subset of a subset of students that would be eligible for behavior at such a level that physical restraint would come into the conversation. And we see a lot of training and support that the department does, but as well as our local school divisions, not only around positive behavior supports, but also around functional behavior analysis and the implementation of behavior intervention plans. This guidance document scopes out a tiered approach that school divisions should take in working and dealing with student behavior. And in the case where physical restraint is required to maintain student safety, that is done so with the curriculum and training that provides for the dignity and safety of students and staff.
Mr. President, yes.
Ms. Atkins.
I think my question is going to sound repetitive again. So but going back to what I just mentioned on page 15, my interpretation of the House Bill 2599 was really to look at, or was the original intent was to look at prohibiting prone restraints. So again, and it's already as part of being prohibited, a prohibited action, the use of restraints or inclusion. Based off of what that House bill was directed, why, again, is it not reasonable is not the right word. Why we shouldn't just add a simple clarification as an example, such as, but not limited to, prone restraints.
So I'll make a comment that goes back to the U.S. Department of Education's publication, Restraint and Seclusion, their resource document. And as the bill alluded to in some of its executive summary information, as well as we do, is that restraint or seclusion should never be used in a manner that restricts a child's breathing or harms the child. That was the language that was used in the House bill, and that's the language that is used in your current version of the proposed regulations. The later language that talks about prone restraint in specificity comes later on within the guidance document. There is no provision of empirical evidence as to why that was included in the U.S. Department's publication, but I will tell you that based off of our correspondence with the federal government, they are reluctant and will not seek additional regulations that outline or identify specific restraints. They see that as the burden of local school divisions because that's who OCR will be working with in the case of any complaint or any issue of nonconformity or monitoring system that the state identifies.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, Dr. Duran.
Back to the language, though, it speaks to, proposes a significant danger to the student. And so I guess your response is that that's only with regards to breathing. Is that why we've not added that? Because to me, I think there's a danger that goes beyond ability to breathe. There's some other, we heard about students experiencing this. And so I'm really torn. I want to commend that we've come a long way with this, but I'm very torn, to be honest with you, on why we cannot include explicitly prohibiting prone restraints. I'm just not convinced yet why we can't do that, because I think it goes above and beyond just breathing or harms a student. And so to me, the intent of the House bill specifically, I think, addresses that, and I don't feel that we've met that yet. So can you please try and help me a little bit more, try to understand that?
I appreciate the conflict. I think this is something that staff on multiple levels have worked with. As we can see from evidence and from experience, really any type of physical restraint is and can be dangerous. And that was the point about the evidence stating that prone restraint isn't the only type of restraint that we should look at in order to cause possible consequences to student and staff safety. The contextual point is that training is required. Anytime that there has been a documented issue when it comes to physical restraint, it has been because it has either not been utilized, a crisis management system technique, or one that staff has not been appropriately trained on. Our response to that is to develop a comprehensive training system that allows for developments in this field to be utilized in the most appropriate way to maintain student and staff safety.
Thank you for that. I still, to my colleagues, I'm still wrestling with the notion of this, because I do think we obviously need to be very concerned about a student's physical harm and danger, which it speaks to, but I'm also concerned about the mental health that involves when this child is put into a prone restraint. And so I don't know that this addresses that yet. And I just would love to hear from my colleagues your thoughts, because I'm really torn with how are we addressing meeting the mental health side of the danger that I think it poses. And we've heard many stories from students, but just a child who's engaged in this, the impact that it has on them, while it may not impact their breathing, I do think it harms them in other ways. And so I thank you, Ms. Atkins, for raising the question, because I does seem reasonable to me to include it for that reason. So I'd love for my colleagues to help me with this because I'm really struggling with this one and trying to see how we're meeting what the intent of the bill was because it does a significant danger to the student is quote from the bill. And to me, a danger is not just physical.
I think you make a good point as far as the need to make sure that the scope by which significant danger is interpreted is broad enough to address all areas of a child's experience. And I'm certainly engaged in the conversation around the prone restraint, whether or not it should be specifically in there. I certainly understand how we might be limiting an educator's ability to do what's best for students in that specific situation if prone restraint was used in a very trained and professional manner. But to your point, I think really it's the mental health concern is not just a prone restraint concern. It's just that period, the experience period of any kind of restraint. If we wanted to make sure there was language in there that said in any kind of restraint, we need to make sure that that's part of the consideration is the impact. But I don't know that I would tie that just to prone restraint only, because we've heard that there's several different other approaches that could be used inappropriately that could cause the same effect.
Anybody else?
So I'm going to ask a couple of other questions. So my background is as a special ed teacher, and I did work with severely emotionally disturbed students in a public day treatment program. These were students who were in our program because the school wanted them there versus in an institution. And so there were instances where I had never used a prone restraint, but I've had to restrain a child from harming themselves. We also did have a timeout room, but we were always documented, always contacted the parents. I mean, it was very restrictive. And so the question, I have a couple of questions. To what degree do the students who might be subjected to this type of restraint under behavior plans? I'm trying to figure out the breadth to which the school division and the teacher and the staff would be aware and trained. For me, the importance is that there is a possibility that there might be a need for restraint, but I want to ensure that the person who's doing it is well trained to do it, so that the types of instances that we've heard from these parents does not occur. And certainly for me, it was very limited. I worked on a lot of other things with my children. This was the last resort. And as I said, only to keep the child from harming themselves or harming another student, but, and so it is a very difficult issue, and issuing policy in this regard is something that we've got to be very careful about. So I want to be comfortable and understand that the individuals out there have the necessary training, and right now I'm not sure that that's happening. And so if I were to say at this point that we may need to do a broader prohibition until we're ensured that that type of activity, type of training occurs, I might be supportive of that. And so I'm throwing this out there.
We'll say, go ahead.
I was going to ask Ms. Atkinson to clarify what you mean by broader prohibition. What do you mean?
So the conversation that we've had about what kind of restraints to prohibit. Maybe we need to go broader now because we can't ensure that the type of training that you are referring to is systemically in place across the Commonwealth.
So you're saying going broader than what's already in here?
Yeah.
Okay.
Including prone restraint.
Oh, okay.
I mean, basically, I'm glad you raised that, Diane, because that is, actually where I was headed with this is that I don't think I'm prepared to rely upon the level of training to be the guide. I mean, I understand what you're saying, and I understand in a perfect world, the training would be such that everybody who received it would become proficient. But the experience in the field seems to be somewhat different than that, at least based upon news reports from various jurisdictions, and the training itself may not, in fact, be adequate. I will say when this language came in, my recollection is, and this is before you were here with us, that the representation from staff, and I think they believed it to be an accurate representation, was that prone restraints were a subset of those restraints that restricted breathing, and therefore the language we have in item 4 that, Kim has pointed out, included prone restraints. It's becoming more and more clear to me that that representation may not have been entirely accurate, although I think it was innocently not accurate. I myself would revise item 4 to say use of seclusion or prone restraints or any other restraints that would restrict breathing, which would be consistent in my view with the 15 principle language, which although you correctly quote the head note, that is item 7, which says simply restraint or seclusion should never be used in a manner that restricts a child's breathing or harms the child. The next sentence is, and again, it's text as opposed to the bulleted one of the 15 principles, prone, i.e. lying face down restraints or other restraints that restrict breathing should never be used because they can cause serious injury or death. I appreciate the comparison to the other types of restraints. We are given really direction by the legislature to follow the principles. It seems to me, and by the way, we did have the AG look at what we had done, and they had concluded that what we have currently follows the legislative mandate. But it does seem to me that, as I said, perhaps the interpretation that what we have done would prohibit prone restraints, again, as a subset of the broader category, just seems to be incorrect at this point. And, I would suggest, as I said, that we move seclusion just because of the English value of it. And as I said, say use seclusion or prone restraints or any other restraints that would restrict breathing among the prohibited items. And, I don't believe, based upon where we are in the regulatory process, and I think we've got the AG here, that would require sending this back through the process. Okay, so.
It was the use of restraint or prone.
May I
Use of
suggest some
seclusion.
specific language that might be of use to the board?
You may.
Okay. So number 4, reworded would state use of prone, in quotation marks, face down restraint, or use of restraint or seclusion in any manner that restricts the student's breathing or harms the student.
One more time? Yeah.
Use of prone, in quotation marks, face down restraint, or use of restraint or seclusion in any manner that restricts a student's breathing or harms the student.
I'd actually like to see it. I'm visual about this stuff. I know what I've written. I don't think it's different from what you've written, except in the order of the words, but I would like to see it printed out before we say, if it's going to become a serious proposal. Do we have that text written somewhere?
I have it written in my own handwriting. Should that be useful?
Yeah,
Okay.
Thanks.
Can I expand on that?
Yeah, please.
I'm sorry. Just, so Mr. Gecker, you have language, I'm sorry, Dr. Hickson. You have language as well.
Yeah,
It would
also-
be helpful for me, Ms. Webb, to have Mr. Gecker's language and Ms. Atkins' language, just because I too am a visual person and I like seeing all of it together. So if you're going to make copies, could you make it all?
You're not going to be able to read this one.
Thank you. Sorry, Dr. Peckson.
Fine now. So you're recommending use of prone, quotation marks, face down restraint or seclusion in any manner.
Such as, but not
So
limited to.
based on the information you
Prone
presented in the context of there are some methods of prone restraint when trained appropriately that can be done effectively and safely. How does this,
Those would no longer be able to be utilized if this language is adopted,
That's right.
which would also incur a change in training curriculums for some, not sure the number, of our local school divisions.
so I was going to come back and make this comment before I had this comment, before this discussion happened. So I have custody of my nephew, a social emotional behavioral challenges, been dealing with that for several years. I've arrived at his school in the moment that he was throwing chairs. Teachers were hands up, trying to, protect the area, protect the child, but not engaging him for whatever reason. And so I have an appreciation for wanting to equip teachers as best as possible, because in that instance, my child could have been hurt. So I have an interest in ensuring teachers have all the tools they have to protect our children and my child, and to protect themselves. And so I just want to make sure whatever language we settle on is just not overly restrictive, but still safe. And I'm not saying anything that anybody doesn't already know, but I'm adding prone. I just want to make sure we're not limiting the options of the teacher. The second to that is back to the training conversation. And based on many of the stats we've heard, either provided by by BDOE or even by our public comment guests, is there any thought or discussion about how we might look at where we have areas of concentrated, repetitive issues with restraint throughout the Commonwealth, and strategically focus on triaging those areas immediately with some sort of training expectations? And I don't know what authority we have really to exercise that, but has there been some thought about, once whatever is in place, whatever words are in place, how are we going to go address the areas that based on the heat map are red?
If I can address the first part of your comment, Mr. Gecker. You mentioned the need to not be too restrictive, but I go back to what House Bill 2599 says, and that is the newer piece of legislation that has come out since we started this process 4 years ago, which sat through various stages of the regulatory process outside the board's control. But what it says is that you're to specifically identify and prohibit the use of any method of restraint, right? And then it goes on to say other things. And so when I read that and I hear the board talking about specifically banning prone in the context of the public comment you've heard, I think that goes to that request to be specific when you know that there's one that you're concerned about. If you believe that there's evidence that will cause that harm. And so I think that, if the board is signaling adding that language, I think that actually helps you comply better with 2599.
I will, if you don't mind, I will echo Dr. Pexton's comments about providing support. We do have divisions in Tidewater and some smaller divisions, as you note, and others likely, who are working with providers to provide development to our teachers. But ensuring that we are supporting those divisions as well, so that they are best equipped to implement whatever it is we decide on in a way that's complicit with what our expectation is, I think is a responsibility certainly that we have. And I know that the department sees it that way as well. But we don't want our divisions to feel as if they don't have the resources or support that we can provide when we can actually do that. So thank you for committing to doing that once we settle on whatever the what is.
I mean, with the legislation in place, can a school division still do prone restraint? I just asked the question, with the legislation in place, can the school division actually do a prone restraint anyway?
Well, again, that's why I raised
Well, I
that
mean-
question, because it says any method of restraint that poses a significant danger to the student. So that a specific danger to the student is what I was talking about, subjective. And in my opinion, I think a significant danger is more than being able to breathe. And that's why I had asked that question earlier, because I think it is subjective. And I think that we as a board should decide on that. But I land on the side of I'm reading the language, a significant danger is much more than just being able to breathe. But I also understand the need to provide support and training and making sure we're helping teachers to have the tools they need, and certainly, but also how are we helping to protect what the students need in that situation? So that's my question, and maybe I'm too caught up in the words of that, but if I'm reading it literally, and I think any form of restraint that, and then I've already said it again, so I just feel, and I look forward to seeing the language that we have, I think that we need to do something different.
The way I read that, I think it goes back to Dr. Holland's observation, perhaps that a strategy becomes a significant danger to the extent that it's, well, again, it is subjective and it's situational. So I don't know that, I'm just not sure that we can assure that even the use of another strategy might not pose a significant danger to the student. It would depend on the situation, but I think I understand the intent, but I'm concerned about our ability really to truly assure that that we've eliminated. So I think maybe trying to get as close as we can.
That's exactly, I agree with that, but I'm thinking this helps us get closer to that. I don't know that we can fully 100% assure that either, but I don't think where we are right now gets us to as close as we can be to do that. But absolutely, Dr. Wilson, I mean, to try and get us there, what are the steps we could move closer towards that? I don't think there's any 100% certainty behind that, but I don't think we're even close there.
Dr. Paxton.
Dr. Hollins or Mrs. Hollins? I want to get it right. Dr. Hollins. So in your version of the proposed language, I think you had mentioned during your comments earlier that there are methods of prone restraint that could be used in a standing or seated position, or were you referring to a different?
There are positions that can be utilized across standing, seating, and prone. Prone is a descriptor that states that the student would be lying face down. Supine is when a student would be lying face up.
Okay. All right. So I just was making sure you weren't implying that the use of prone face down restraints, meaning the use of prone, standing restraints is fine, but that's more referred to as supine. So you're basically saying any kind of face down.
Correct. So which, from our previous example, when I talked about the use of the tripod technique for a prone restraint, that would no longer be able to be utilized.
Yes, ma'am.
So in looking at these three options, I think Ms. Holland's language would potentially permit restraint that would
And this is
restrict
not my
breathing.
language. It's actually missing a term. So I think that
The language that you proposed for us would, I think, potentially allow restraint that restricts breathing, because at this point, I think the language proposed by Mr. Gecker probably gets more directly at what we are concerned about.
And I understand there's just a typo on the language that you received. There's a restraint missing.
Okay.
So I apologize that wasn't reflected accurately. I was not condoning I was not trying to do a workaround.
Can I get,
Yeah.
Yeah, can I get some clarification on where you're saying what's missing?
Yes, so in your proposed language, everything is correct with the exception of it says use of prone, face down restraint, or use of restraint should be there. Or seclusion. So adding in a restraint or between of
Okay.
and seclusion.
Does that change then that, now I wanted to go back, does that change? Because I was wondering where you saw that maybe there was a loophole or gap in her language. How are you interpreting that?
So the absence of that restraint was the concern I had. Adding face down certainly is an additional descriptor of what we mean by prone.
All right, so what is the sense of the board at this point? Is there a desire to amend the language?
I support your rewording.
I support your rewording as well.
I wasn't looking for that yet. I mean, is there a desire to make a change from the
Yes.
proposal?
Oh, sorry.
So that's okay. And then of these, honestly, I don't use as many commas as ended up in here, but my English is not that good. Of the three versions, what do we think captures the sense?
I would recommend your version adding face down after prone.
Prone.
So use of
almost
seclusion or
open paren.
prone, face down restraints from Dr. Holland's version, and then continue on with your.
Why? The reason why I support Mr. Gecker's is because I don't think any prone.
Yeah.
That's all. Yeah.
That's what this is meant to do.
Right.
Eliminate it. All right, and I would get rid of the second comma, actually, I think.
Is that okay?
But I need an English major. All right, so it would read use of seclusion or prone, open paren, face down, close paren. I just don't want to use quotes. Restraints or any other restraints that would restrict breathing. Is that where we are? All right. Is there any other discussion on this? I'm not eliminating it. It's a serious question, not a let's move on question.
Sure. So, Mr. Gecker, in thinking about the fact that this, as Dr. Hollins mentioned, is an area that continues to have research activity around it, that it is an evolving area, I would like for us to remain aware of how things, training, evidence-based success or not, that we all remain aware of what's going on, certainly in our school divisions, but also nationally, because we know where we are today, but I think we have to remain aware of how this particular issue, all issues around education, are advancing or not. So we are making the best decision we can right now with what we have available. But there may come a time when we need to revisit the regulations, of course, to either become more restrictive or less. And so I think we just need to, as a board, acknowledge that need.
Maybe even, I really like what you just said, Dr. Wilson, but can we be more specific, saying 6 months from now, I'll hear a report on how this, the change in the regulations have been used at the local levels, and if there's been, what the reporting is around that.
The part of the budget last year gave us some funding to do training once the regulations go in place. So I would think that we can provide something annually, but I don't know.
Oh, okay, that's fine.
I don't know that we could do it in 6 months.
I have a question, and on page 24, bottom of page 24, training, and I guess this would be a question to the Attorney AG, or maybe possibly, if we included a number 5 here, would that cause us this to go back to the whole process again? A number 5 on, because what I would love to propose here is something, I don't know the words, I need help with this, but I think training here all speaks to what needs to be done with regards to the techniques of any of this. However, I think it's lacking about training that needs to occur for when a child has gone through this and experienced this. What kind of supports are we going to help teachers and staff to help with after that? And I don't know if that would alter this section greatly.
I would kind of need to see your exact word
Okay.
to be able to.
I should have thought about it sooner.
Would it?
Let me,
So at the page.
it started on the bottom of 24, went on to page 25. It's section 7 training.
So it would be going.
Section 8, 8 VA training on the bottom of 24. This speaks to school divisions that employ physical or restraint or seclusion shall, and it speaks to 4 things that they must do for training. And all of these speak to training that involves prior to or actual restraint or seclusion occurring, and there doesn't speak to anything about training that what do we do for after that? What are types of training? Because I do think staff need some training on how would they support children and families if they have experienced this. And that's missing to me.
Dan, or Mr. Gecker?
Yeah.
Maybe.
I agree. I think that's very insightful that it's a void in this. And whatever least path of resistance that we can go through to make it happen. I'm just looking at number 1.
Okay.
Where it says ensure that all school personnel receive initial training that focuses on skills related to positive behavior support, conflict prevention, de-escalation, and crisis response. Could we say de-escalation, crisis response, and
Post. Okay.
incident emotion, whatever?
That would definitely meet what I.
Rather than adding a whole
Oh, number
nother
5. Okay, that's fair.
statement, could
Yeah.
we add just 4 or 5 words on the end of that?
Yes, and the AG is saying that would be fine. All right, Dr. Hollins, can you help us think of how that might be worded for number 1?
Well, I think the question is number 1.
Number 1.
Prior to that, but I think prior to that is to Dr. Hollins, in the context of the training that most might engage with, is it common to have content in that would, educate educators on that post incident intervention? So
And
before we
if that-
put it in here, not to say that it can't be created
Right.
and added, but I just was curious, do you know or aware of, do most of those trainings like the,
And before you answer, if that's implied in number 1, then help us to how we can make it a little bit more clear. Because maybe that is part of that, to Dr. Fexton's question, but it's not clear for me that it is. This speaks to prior to skills needed to do a restraint or seclusion.
Sure. So I will answer that question in 2 parts. The first is that pedagogically speaking, crisis response does typically include a de-escalation and follow-up period, typical to what you all have seen in responses to traumatic events or even crisis response teams at the school level. So I do think there is some inherent understanding there. I'm hearing from the board that there is a wish to kind of pull some of that post-incident part out and provide support to staff and students. So I think that this starts that conversation. However, if you want to add in specific language around de-escalation and then specific supports to students and staff based on individualized needs, based on a comprehensive system of support that could be identified within training packets, I think that's something for the board to consider.
Okay.
Okay. Where do we think we are now with what we're going to move forward with? Going to make the change to 4.
Yes.
Dr. Lane correctly points out that, I was tinkering with the first half and left the back piece off, which says or harms the student, which is consistent with the existing 4 and consistent with, as I said, item 7. So that would be tacked on. on my proposed language, I would add to the back end of that, that would restrict breathing or harms the student.
It'd be harm, not harms, just for grammatical.
Oh, you should do that.
Restrict breathing or harm the student,
All right.
just in the way that you wrote it.
Just to clarify, when Mr. or Dr. Duran, when we're talking about harm to the student, taking into consideration the whole aspect of the child, the social,
Yes.
emotional, the trauma behind being secluded or restrained or removed, are you thinking that the addition to number 1 on page 24 will take care of that?
Yeah, with the wording that Dr. Pexon was helping me with and Dr. Hollins, yes, I think that would.
Okay.
Just making it more clear that the crisis response and the de-escalation is not just for the actual physical restraint and seclusion, but post what needs to happen for families and students in that process and training around that. And I think for teachers and school staff, helping provide them with some strategies for that. Because I'm sure it's also, for staff who have to do this, I'm sure it's also they need some training
I
and
agree.
support as well.
Forgive me for asking this question, but I would be very interested in knowing which of the training programs, these hot areas, where the hot areas are, where the restraint is taking place within the state of Virginia and the divisions, and the different trainings that are available, and to see, to measure where the most effective training is coming from and how it's addressing the needs of our children and our teachers at the same time, to see if they are coming full circle.
Absolutely.
Okay. Is there a motion floating around in this?
You have the language, maybe.
Well, are we making any changes for Dr. Duran right now?
Well, I would hope so.
Yeah,
I would
hope so
put on the
too. So
motion.
I don't have that language.
I don't have the exact language either, but I would move that, well, were you able to come up with, no? Want me to
No,
try
I
it myself?
have a little something, I think.
Okay, well,
So,
what do you have? Dr. Hollins, sorry. put you on
and
the spot.
crisis response, including follow-up support and social emotional strategy instruction.
For students and families, I would just add. Well, students,
Revising
families,
number 1?
yes.
Okay.
So the language that I have states, and crisis response, including follow-up support and social emotional strategy support for students, staff, and families.
Yes. So I would make a motion that we would amend number 1 on the bottom of page 24 with that language.
I would second.
Okay. We'll do them separately. So all in favor or any other discussion on that? If not, all in favor signify by saying, oh, go ahead, Jamel.
I'm sorry. Could we perhaps strike the word initial? Because we are implying that this is not just at the front end, it's also ongoing, throughout the process.
Open to that. but-
Good.
Okay, so we have an amendment to the motion?
Make the amendment.
And amendment, okay, we're good here?
Is that a
So,
friendly amendment? So yes.
okay, we're going to vote on this one now. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay. And let's go back, I guess, to, item 4.
Mr. President,
Yes.
on page 15, item 4, the changing the language to use of conclusion or prone restraint or any other restraints that would harm breathing or harms the student? Is it harm or harms?
I think it's, or would harm is the way it's currently written.
Or
So
would-
it would end up being use of seclusion or prone, open paren, lying face down, again, to be consistent with the 15 principles document, closed paren, or any other restraints that would restrict breathing or harm the student. Is where we are at this point. And I hope we give the staff a little bit of leeway to edit for English.
We didn't agree to defining prone restraint.
The original version, as I said, I had face down in there. So if we're not going to agree to that, that's okay. But I just,
Your version,
well, my scratch is here. I'm sorry. Okay. So the question is, can we add lying face down, which is, as I said, consistent with the text of the 15 principle document?
On page 16 of the 15 principles, it says prone parentheses lying
Lying
face down.
Closed paren.
I think to be consistent with the 15 principles, yes, we should.
I mean,
Why wouldn't we be consistent with 15 principles?
I thought that's actually what prone
To,
meant.
to be clear, it actually says i.e. lying face down
Yeah.
as an example. So
Okay.
I mean, I'm happy either way because I think it's duplicative in a sense, but since people wanted clarity.
Okay. Motion as restated by President Gecker.
All right, so I have a motion. Is there a second?
Second.
All right, any other discussion on this? If not, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, that's where we are on item G. Thank you all very much.
now you have to do the whole reg.
Oh, you're right, thank you. All right, so now we have proposed and adopted amendments to the regs, and I guess we are we ready to vote finally on the proposed regulations governing the use of seclusion and restraint in public and elementary and secondary schools in Virginia? If so, is there a motion to adopt them as amended? Thank you, Dr. Duran.
Second.
Thank you, Ms. Atkinson. Any other discussion on the whole regs? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay,
Mr. Gecker, before Dr. Hollins leaves the podium,
yes.
I'd just like to take a moment to thank the department and with the leadership of Dr. Hollins and Dr. Lane and others. This has been a long process, and I think the work that has been done, I hope, is a reflection, and folks recognize it as a reflection of our sincere desire to be responsive, but also to provide support as necessary so that we are addressing the needs of all of our children and holding them in their highest regard. And so thank you all for your leadership and for the time and effort that you continue and will continue to put into this effort.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wilson. We appreciate the opportunity. And I'd just like to thank my staff. And as you all can imagine, much of this work was done prior to my arrival at the department. So my thanks also to John Eisenberg as well. But the department looks forward to supporting our local school divisions. Appreciate it.
Okay, thank you. All right, item H, final review of an amendment to Virginia's Consolidated State Plan under the Every Student Succeeds Act of 2015, Amendment 3.
Good morning, President Gecker, Vice President
morning.
Atkinson, members of the board, and Dr. Lane. Item H on today's agenda is, as you said, the final review of Amendment 3 to Virginia's ESSA State Plan. This item was accepted for first review by the board during the June board meeting. The purpose of this amendment is to make 4 changes to the state plan that are recommended by the department and to provide information that the U.S. Department of Education requires be added to the plan. If approved, accountability changes will be implemented beginning with the accountability ratings for the 2019-2020 school year. And the changes are, for graduation rate, the amendment proposes to use current year instead of previous year cohort data to calculate the federal graduation indicator. No changes to the federal graduation rate targets are proposed. For the mathematics targets, revised federal mathematics targets are proposed based on statewide data from the new math test. In your agenda item, you can see the current targets are crossed out and the new proposed targets are underlined. You may note that the majority of changes are within 1 to 2 points of the current targets. For chronic absenteeism, as we discussed in June, the amendment proposes to use the chronic absenteeism rate of the school at the 20th percentile of enrollment as the baseline, and to use 2017-2018 school year data as the baseline year. And this methodology is currently used to determine the federal math and reading targets and results in targets that are more closely aligned with the state accreditation benchmarks. For the use of Title II Part A funds, the amendment proposes to use Title II Part A state-level funds to support training and technical assistance to school divisions on upcoming revisions to the teacher evaluation system. And a new element to this agenda item is the inclusion of data on inexperienced and out-of-field teachers. In late June, USCD did approve the Second Amendment to Virginia's state plan. As you'll recall, this amendment provided the definition of ineffective teacher, which is a teacher who is both out of field and inexperienced, that was approved by the board to meet federal reporting requirements. The approval letter indicated that by September 15th, Virginia must include additional information in the state plan to describe this data element. USCD has indicated that updating an existing data table in the plan to include data on the new definition should fulfill this requirement, and that is provided to you in your agenda item. Public comment on the proposed changes was announced via 3 superintendent's memos. We did not receive any written or oral comments. However, a committee of practitioners meeting was held in late June. Committee members expressed favor for the amendment items in general and support in particular of the proposed use of Title II funds. The amendment was also discussed at the Federal Program Coordinators Academy meetings in June and July. No other questions or concerns or comments have been received at the department. The Superintendent of Public Instruction recommends the Board of Education approve the amendment to Virginia's Consolidated State Plan. Upon approval by the board, the amendment will be submitted to the U.S. Department of Education for review and approval.
Okay, thank you. Are there any questions?
I don't have a question.
Please, yeah.
So I don't have any questions, and I appreciate the work that you've done to get us here. But I just want to make one observation. When we look at our mathematic targets, those targets are, if you follow the numbers across, the goal is 70 along the way, and some of our subgroups are already meeting those targets. And so I just want to highlight that this is for federal only, because on the state level, really the work that we've done in the last 2 years is really to create a system of continuous improvement. So for our localities that are already meeting the targets, we don't want you to be static. We want you to continue to improve. And so I just wanted to highlight the difference between this as a federal requirement versus where we look at the state level.
Okay, any other comments? Questions? If not, is there a motion? Thank you. That's to approve this. Is there a second?
Second.
Okay. Any other discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Okay, I think Dr. Lane has raised an issue about the last item. I'd like to go ahead and take just a quick 10-minute recess. If that's okay, and then we're going to come on back. Okay, we're going to come on back into session if everybody's ready. We're going to move back for a second to item G, not to change meaning, but to make a clarification. What? No?
I'm sorry. I'm emoting. I don't mean to.
Oh, well, we're going to change this one too?
Yeah, well, yeah,
All right. Like I said, I don't think there's an intent to change meeting, but the, Attorney General has suggested that the language we adopted could perhaps be read to eliminate the use of all seclusion, which it was not intended to do. You've been handed a, revision proposed here that says use of seclusion, comma, prone, i.e. lying face down, restraint, or any other restraints that would restrict breathing or harm the student. Susan, are you, that where we are?
the concern, of course, was that it would have.
Yeah, you got to be up here. Yep.
Thank you, Mr. President. Of course, the concern was just to make sure what the intent of the board, what the board's intent is actually in the language. And so my understanding of your intent is that this will read so that you intend that the phrase restrict breathing or harm the student applies to seclusion. It applies to prone, lying face down restraint, or any other restraints. Is that correct?
Yes.
That is your intent.
I want that
Okay.
to modify, which,
So,
as you know, honestly, I think my original version did, but I'm happy to yield to the legal advice of my counsel.
it's, it's a little tricky because we want to make sure we get all the commas in the right place because as we know, a comma can, so use of seclusion, comma, prone, use of seclusion, comma, prone restraint.
Yeah.
Susan, might I suggest that we just add a 4 and a 5, one that says use of seclusion that would restrict breathing or harm the student. Number 5, use of prone, i.e. face down restraint, or any other restraints that restrict breathing or harm the student.
That would actually, I realize that's a little bit more, but that would make it so crystal clear that
That's fine.
I
with me.
actually would feel even more comfortable
Everybody
with that.
follow that? Basically move seclusion to its own, shift everything else, 5, 6, 7, 8, down one number.
Yeah.
And then have use of prone, i.e. lying face down, restraint, or any other restraints that would restrict breathing or harm the student as its own separate number 4.
That would be crystal clear. I think that would be the best way.
All right, now, do I need to go back and adopt the whole regs again? Oh, Dr. Paxton, thank you.
Sorry, this is very minor, but we're in change mode right now. But at the bottom of 8, there's a random B. Underneath 8, there's B.
Well, that goes back to the.
That speaks back to
code
the
section.
A, which is the,
Yeah. So it aligns to, if you go back to the bottom of 14.
It's just it's a
It's
spacing
the
issue. We'll just move the B over.
Mhm.
We'll catch that in technical
Minor.
review, yeah.
all right, then I think we know where we are. Not a change of meaning from the original adoption, but a slight change in the commas. So is there a motion then to adopt separating out seclusion as we just suggested, and then the restraint, with seclusion being a new number 5, everything else being moved down 1 as suggested here? Is there a
So
motion?
moved.
Thank you, Ms. Atkins. Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, do I need to re-adopt it all? Okay, then is there a motion to adopt the entire regulations governing use of seclusion and restraint in public elementary and secondary schools in Virginia, final stage as amended again? Thank you, Dr. Duran. Second, Ms. Atkinson. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, thank you all very much. Nobody likes to have it done that sloppily, but drafting at the podium is difficult. So we move on to I, final review of advisory board on teacher education and licensure recommendations for the annual education preparation program profile required by the regulations governing the review and approval of education programs in Virginia.
Good morning, President Gecker,
Good
members
morning.
of the board, and Dr. Lane. It is a pleasure for me to present this item to you, and I am pleased to introduce you to Dr. Tricia Storr Hunt, who is the chair of the Advisory Board on Teacher Education and Licensure, and who is chair of the Education Department at the University of Richmond. So she is here to help in case you have questions that she can answer from the perspective of higher education. Just a reminder that these are recommendations from ABTEL, and during their deliberations, there were 4 individuals who represent higher education at that meeting and involved in the discussion. Just to recap, the profile is required by the regulations governing the review and approval of education programs. The regulations detail 11 requirements that must be reported by the institutions of higher education with approved programs. In addition, there is an item 12, which indicates that any other data that the Board of Education requests from the institutions must be submitted. So the Advisory Board on Teacher Education and Licensure met, and they submitted additional recommendations for data and information that they suggested that you require that the colleges and universities report. All of those are in red font in your board item, and we discussed those during the first review. But just to recap a little bit, during first review, the board did ask whether these data and information are duplicative of other collections that the institutions of higher education are required to submit, including federal and state collections. We have found that, and you can see from the chart that was provided, that these data are really not duplicative of other collections in which higher education must submit. But Dr. Storr Hunt did send the first review item to the deans and directors of all our colleges and universities that prepare teachers and other instructional personnel to receive feedback from them. You have received detailed information regarding the feedback from those institutions of higher education. So what I'd like to do now is go through very quickly the recommendations from ABTEL and make some suggestions and recommendations based upon the comments received by the deans and the chairs. So if you will, we will be looking at the recommendation from ABTEL with the red font. Now, one of the colleges and universities that commented, and there were a few, they were very complimentary of the additional clarification and definitions provided in the document. There was a question about whether the data would be required for initial and advanced programs. The answer to that is yes. We would need information on all programs, and when we develop the collection instrument, we will need to distinguish between those two. If you will move on to item 4, the colleges and universities, or at least there was one suggestion, that there be a definition included for underrepresented minority. And underrepresented minority definition could be any racial and ethnic population whose representation is disproportionately less than their proportion in the general population. So that could be added to that particular element that ABTEL requested. Also, if you'll go down to the next bullet, several of the colleges and universities indicated they do not collect gender non-binary data. So the suggestion is to request that data by gender because it is not available. And there was also a question to clarify whether we wanted race and ethnicity or just ethnicity. So I would suggest that we include race and ethnicity in that collection item. If you'll go down to the bullet next to last, candidate status of financial aid need based on eligibility for the Pell Grant admitted to education endorsement programs and the educator preparation program compared to the overall institution at large. Recommending that be stricken based upon the fact that some of the colleges and universities cannot provide that data. It's not available at the present time. If you go to item 8, there was a suggestion for item 8, but remember, item 8 is already in the regulations, so we really cannot change the language. We certainly could provide some guidance. The recommendation was to change the word satisfaction ratings to performance ratings. And there was also a request to change the and, satisfactory ratings by school administrators and clinical experience supervisors, to and or, but certainly we can provide some clarification to them, but we cannot change those regulations at this time. If you look at item 9, we do need to provide some clarification, which can be in guidance to the institutions of higher education, that graduates does include program completers. So please let me explain the difference. Colleges and universities have graduates who are program completers, but sometimes they have individuals who complete their programs who already have degrees and who are not a graduate of that institution, but a program completer. Certainly, they would want to report those as they do for Title II, as well as for biennial reporting. And that clarification also needs to be added to item 10. In item 12, the first bullet, the percentage of scholarships awarded to non-underrepresented minorities compared to underrepresented minorities, and the dollar value of scholarships awarded to non-underrepresented minorities compared to underrepresented minorities in the educator preparation program. I'm suggesting that be stricken because colleges and universities have indicated that that is not available for them to report at this time. There was one comment that was very appreciative of the collection, the first collection, being conducted on May 1st, 2020, because these regulations became effective August of 2018. But there was also the caution They would like to know the elements, which of course we hope you will approve today, so that they can begin their collection of these data that will need to be reported in May of 2020.
And board members, because the information came from the universities after your packet went out, Patty and I did work through this morning, and we have all this drafted out. I didn't want to give it out until you were willing to formally accept it for consideration. But if you want everything that she just walked through, we do have that written out, so you don't have to do it from the podium. And so I meant to do that before she started, but are you comfortable with us submitting a substitute at this point?
I'd like to see it.
Yeah. Yeah, Ms. Atkins.
For data that is currently unavailable, I'm assuming that it was offered as a consideration for a reason. Our efforts to see if there would be opportunities for it to become available in the future. Is that a discussion that is being considered within the universities?
Certainly, that could be a conversation that we could have with the institutions of higher education. Not all of the institutions, I think there were about 5 who actually responded, and then certainly there were some institutions represented at the ABTEL meeting. But we can certainly engage them in conversation, because you can add elements later, because the regulation clearly says that other items that the board may request can be added. But at this time, we are concerned about requesting data in May of 2020 that colleges and universities have not collected, do not currently collect, and would not be able to provide that data as quickly as May of 2020.
Any other questions? Yeah, Ms. Atkinson.
Patty, I remember, I think as we talked about this last month, maybe, that some of these data streams are things that we do collect and they come in every other year. And so how will we, because it's a report that how will we distinguish it so that the public understands that the data may not be this current year, but they're only required to report it every other year?
We'll need to give the colleges and universities guidance in that regard. This is an annual report, but you are absolutely correct, and I'll give you a good example. The biennial data that they will be, that they are required to report to you is every other year. So the last data collected will be the data that will be populated in the report. So there will need to be some additional guidance to the colleges and universities, as well as an explanation of the data when it's posted on the website.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I have not read the superintendent's recommendation, so I'll go ahead and do that now. The superintendent of public instruction recommends the Board of Education approve ABTEL's recommendations for the annual education preparation program profile. And I think that since this recommendation was written, and the superintendent can agree that with the revisions as suggested in response to the comments by the institutions of higher education.
I agree.
Just a quick question for Dr. Storhunt. I know that you all sent out an invitation to institutions to provide feedback, heard from 4 or 5. Do you have the sense that those 4 or 5 are representative of institutions around the Commonwealth, so that we, as we're potentially making these changes, we are covering the needs of all, or at least recognizing the impact on all types of institutions?
Yes, we did hear from public and private. And I do think the areas where they had the greatest concern about the gender non-binary and particularly the financial aid information, I think it isn't just that the programs can't collect the data, it's that the institutions as a whole did not have that data available. And because of the comparative nature of the profile, I think they had real concerns about that. I do see that probably in other institutions. There may have been people who were not in to respond, and the window was relatively short, but I feel pretty comfortable saying that others would agree to the changes.
That's where I was trying to get to make sure that we're represented. Thank you.
Ms. Atkins?
For the benefit of the public, and maybe it's in here, but should the definition of a program completer be spelled out?
We can certainly add that in the guidance document as well. Yes, we will definitely do that. Thank you.
Anybody else?
Mr. Gecker, if I could say, I just want to publicly thank Dr. Store Hunt for all of her work. She has done a tremendous job in the last few years as chair of ABTEL, and her leadership has been impeccable, and I just wanted to publicly thank her for her excellent service.
Okay, thank you. Is there a desire to move forward with this today as sort of wholesalely amended, or?
They need the information.
Yeah, I know they need it. Yeah, I mean, go ahead.
I was just going to say, based on the outreach that we've done, the need to collect to begin collecting the information as expeditiously as we can, and given the written comments and suggestions that are here in front of us as Ms. Pitts has gone through, I feel comfortable moving forward. I don't see a compelling reason for us not to be able to move forward, I suppose is what I'm saying.
Okay. I guess reading this stuff is no longer a requirement of voting on it.
We've heard it.
Yeah. All right, then. Is there a motion or any other discussion?
So moved to adopt the recommended revisions based on comments from institutions of higher education on item agenda I.
Okay. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. Dr. Duran? Yeah. Any other discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
We gotta get better. Yeah. Good morning.
Good morning.
Item J, first review of proposed revisions to the SOQ.
Good morning, Dr. Lane, Mr. Gecker, members of the board. Yesterday, the SOQ committee received amended proposals for the SOQ. Today, they're here before you on first review and will return in September, incorporating changes from yesterday's discussion. And just to remind you, we're looking at these proposals on the screen here. Of the proposals we were looking at, there's basically three clusters of proposals you looked at yesterday. Targeted compensation adjustments, the at-risk add-on proposal, teacher leader mentor programs, and English learner teachers, which were presented beginning with your April retreat. There were 4 new proposals presented yesterday based on discussion at your June meeting: reading specialists, work-based learning coordinators, expansion of class size reduction, and principal mentorship. And then the remaining recommendations are reaffirmations of your 2016 recommendations. I just wanted to recap some of the discussion from yesterday to make sure we captured it correctly, and moving forward, we thread the needle correctly when we come back in September. The most substantial change I think we discussed was consolidating the targeted compensation adjustments proposal with the at-risk add-on proposal and class size reduction. We're going to move forward and present a proposal next month that would pull these resources in a consolidated proposal, and we'll redraft it so that it would provide options to serve at-risk students, including recruitment and retention incentives for experienced teachers to teach in challenge schools, as well as class size reduction. Other substantial changes that we were looking at included taking a closer look at the metric that we use for distributing the reading specialist, as suggested by
Ms. Atkinson. And there were some other technical edits that were recommended as well.
So back to the reading specialists. So my understanding is the current program that we use for targeting services for students based on their performance, typically on the PALS test, is fairly broadly drafted so that they can use those dollars for a lot of different things that may not necessarily mean a teacher. And so as we look at it, I think we need to take that into consideration.
To retain some of that flexibility?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because otherwise, or understand the impact that we might have if we
took it away.
Right. Okay.
And what about under work-based learning coordinators? I know it's on a resource standpoint, it's a much smaller amount of an investment, but in addition to cultivate relationships with the business community, seeing if there's a way to incorporate in collaboration with the Virginia Workforce Board and joint resources. I know we don't control that through the standards of quality from an investment standpoint, but something to that nature.
I don't think we would need to make a language change to do that because there are because the way it's drafted, once the resources come to the department would establish that program. But if you would prefer that the language be more directive about forming partnerships with organizations throughout the state, we can do that.
Well, I guess the intent was to leverage resources that are doing the same thing.
Oh, to avoid duplication of
Right.
effort.
So it's more collaborative in nature the duplication in resources is there, but sometimes the strategy or the intent or the outcome could be different.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
All right, and the other major component of the discussion yesterday was around prioritization moving forward with the recommendations. And what we heard clearly was that the consolidated proposal to serve students in poverty, teacher leaders and mentors, and English learner teachers should move forward as priority 1. On priority 2, we used we directly heard that principal mentorship should be in there. But there was also discussion about how things, when they link to the comprehensive plan, that they should also be included. So we think it may be appropriate to include specialized student support personnel and school counselors within that as well. The other proposals that remain in priority 3 are the reaffirmation of the 2016 proposals, but also the work-based learning coordinator and the reading specialist proposal. I think an argument could be made to shift those into priority 2 because those are very closely linked with equity and implementation of the profile of a graduate. So that summarizes what we captured from yesterday, and I'd be happy to take any comments moving forward. And our recommendation is that the board accept this for first review.
Right, I think the board's prepared to accept it for first review. Are there any other comments?
for my takeaway, were you saying, Zach, that priority 1 will now include principal mentorship and priority 2 will now include work-based learning coordinators and regional specialists, just based off of what you just said?
Oh, no, I proposed priority 2 remaining what it is, but, well, everything that's in priority 2 would remain, but we would add work-based learning coordinators and reading specialists to priority 2.
You don't think, I thought my takeaway from yesterday was principals mentorship would be a priority 1, knowing what we've heard, the importance of leadership within the school and the impact that has on teacher leadership.
I would be happy to engage in that discussion if the board, if that's the pleasure of the board.
You know, it seems to me where we are in the process is the request to prioritize really was an executive branch request as opposed to a Board of Ed request.
I don't know.
And I'm not sure at this point we need to engage in a prioritization exercise. I mean, at some point when we settle on final recommendations and or issue SOQs, somebody may ask us, you know, what's most important because the cost of the overall program is so large. I think personally, I think it's premature, and I understand where you're headed, and we talked about the things that impact teachers first and all that. But as I said, from my perspective right now, that is an accommodation to the executive branch that the board doesn't need to make today. And, you know, I don't feel it just, I just don't see it productive to get bogged down in that debate at this stage. You know, once the final recs are in, we can talk about, you know, if the board is going to make legislative, you know, a legislative package, if you will, that argues, you know, more forcefully for some things than others. But at this stage, you know, I think we're just trying to get it right. And I know costs are always in the back of everybody's mind, but, you know, our job is to do it right now without regard to the cost. The cost piece of this is out of our purview. I mean, it can't be ignored. As I said, I'm not naive, but on the other hand, it just shouldn't be the focus. The second, I would comment that I know if you could go back a slide or two, the consolidated proposal piece. I think that right now still is in the staff realm as opposed to the board realm. And I understand how the comments could be read to say, let's consolidate them. But the comments really were geared toward finding a different mechanism to provide additional funding to schools in poverty and providing some flexibility to staff based upon, you know, lower PTRs for less experienced, you know, teachers and perhaps greater PTRs for, you know, if divisions were willing to use that extra money to hire more experienced teachers. I am not yet at the point, and the rest of the board may be, but I'm not yet at the point where I understand the implications of consolidating the at-risk add-on enough to make the determination that that is the path we're going to go down, or that I would suggest we go down. I want to, and I've, you know, talked to Dr. Lane earlier this morning about this. I need to understand this a good bit more in terms of what that entails and, you know, what flexibility it gives or what flexibility it takes away before I say, yes, let's go ahead and just combine them. And I know when I say me, I'm just talking about my vote as opposed to the board as a whole. So I would consider this still in the staff proposal range as opposed to a board mandate to consolidate. And I think that captures what we talked about yesterday.
And I just want to agree with Mr. Gecker on the prioritization. I would not spend a lot of time on that. That was not even a request to the executive branch, to be fair. That was just something that we wanted to know as an agency, and really I wanted to know so that I
You are
could.
the executive branch, buddy.
I just don't want anyone to think that the governor's office had asked for that. And when that's not the case, really, it's us getting a general sense of that, and then I feel like we got enough yesterday, but I don't think we have to specify by.
We'll
by
call it a
tiers.
subset of the executive branch.
Glad we had this discussion because we will not bring it back in order of priorities.
Yeah.
But in our document that we provide you next month, we'll draw clearer linkages to the comprehensive plan.
Well, as we talk it through over the next couple of months, because we have asked for a revision in the interim because we take August off, you know, it may be they end up consolidated, but let's work it through and see what makes sense. Ms. Atkinson.
So just back to the at-risk add-on, because that is a very broad bucket. And it has a lot of different programs in it. And so I think for us to better understand, if we were to use it to, if the intent is to use it to provide additional bodies in the classroom, then we need to understand the implications of how that might impact what currently sits in that funding stream. Because I think it's not always people that is impacted by that funding stream. So just throwing that out there.
Okay. With that, unless there are any other, you know, comments, I think we had a pretty robust discussion yesterday. You know, as I said, I think the board is prepared to accept this on first review. And, you know, certainly these comments should not be read to mean that we are anything but completely satisfied with what staff is doing on this. I mean, you guys have done an awful lot of work. We've been around the state together. I mean, it's, it's moving along at a pretty good pace for, based upon our normal rate of speed. So we are particularly happy with that. So thank you.
All right, thank you.
Okay, first review of proposed amendments to the licensure regulation for school personnel to comport with the legislation passed by the General Assembly under the fast-track provisions of the Administrative Process Act.
Thank you, President Gecker, members of the board, and Dr. Lane. I want to give you a little bit of context regarding this item before we go into the details. As you know, we went through a very long process to conduct a comprehensive review of our licensure regulations. That began in about 2013, and those regulations became effective August 23, 2018. During which time, there were statutory requirements that we needed to adhere to. I actually brought to you in 2017 some revisions based upon the 2017 General Assembly. However, the Registrar's Office asked us to hold because the complication was that we already had a set of regulations that were going through the process. Trying to implement new requirements or new revisions into a revision document became very complex. So that's the reason I'm here today, to bring to you regulations, which actually are statutory requirements, which we have already implemented in our office, but we need to align the regulations with the statutory requirements from the 2017, 2018, and 2019 General Assemblies. In the attachment to your item, I color-coded the revisions so that you could clearly identify what they are, and also gave you the legislation that prompted those changes. So I don't plan to go through each of those with you today unless you have questions or wish for me to do that. However, I would caution more to the public that they have to be careful because some of the legislation in 2017, the text, was changed in 2018. So you really should not be looking at solely 2017 because that's not going to reflect the changes in the attachment because of subsequent changes by the General Assembly. So as you will know, there were some changes in reciprocity that happened in 2017 and 2018. So there have been changes subsequent. So the best rule of thumb would be to look at the attachment, which has collected all of those revisions in one document. There's really no board discretion since these are statutory requirements. There are a few edits, but primarily this document really reflects things that were requested by the General Assembly that we need to incorporate. So I would be happy to go over them if you'd like, but I know you've had this document and have read it, and happy to answer any questions that you may have. This is for first review, and the Superintendent of Public Instruction recommends that the board receive this item for first review, and which will comport the regulations with legislation passed by the General Assembly, and authorize the Department of Education staff to make technical edits if necessary and continue with the procedures of the Administrative Process Act, but certainly that will not occur until final approval by the board. Thank you.
Okay, are there any questions? Thank you. Yeah, please.
Patty, I just want to thank you for the attachment with the color coding because that has made it so much easier for us to, review the material and understand the differences. I do have one question. Will this be under expedited because we don't have much discretion?
It will be under fast track.
Fast track, okay.
Yes, so we won't have to wait a long time to have these incorporated into the regulations.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, anybody else? If not, thank you, and the board accepts this on first review.
Thank you very much.
Item L, first review of the proposed 2017 Computer Science Standards of Learning Curriculum Framework.
Good morning, President Gecker, Vice President Atkinson, Dr. Lane, and ladies and gentlemen of the board. I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today concerning the proposed Computer Science Standards of Learning Curriculum Framework. Joining me today for this presentation is Dr. Ann Peterson, Science Coordinator. The standards of learning are a critical communication with the citizens of the Commonwealth, parents, the business community, and higher education, in that these standards convey expectations and intended outcomes for K-12 education. Equally as important, the standards and the frameworks serve as key guidance for instructional leaders and teachers in planning computer science curricula and computer science programming. The Computer Science Standards of Learning were adopted by the board in November of 2017. The Computer Science Curriculum Framework that I'm presenting to you today was constructed to support teachers in the instruction of these newly adopted standards. The Computer Science Standards of Learning Curriculum Framework writing process was an informed, collaborative effort that included computer science teachers and leaders in the Commonwealth. The Curriculum Framework Committee met to review both national and international computer science curriculum. One focus of the committee was to synthesize a framework that would be of greater support to teachers, particularly to those that may not have efficacy in computer science instruction and content integration, as well as those new to the teaching field. Multiple rounds of teachers and leaders provided input and feedback that ultimately informed the creation of this framework. The curriculum framework draft before you includes the following elements to support each standard. Context of the standard. This context provides a broader explanation of the background information needed for teachers in their instruction. It will help identify prior student learning and clarify expectations for students. Essential skills. Student skills describe performance expectations that teachers can use to evaluate student learning. These range from discussion-oriented skills to products created as part of an iterative development process. Intentional inclusion of opportunities to build the 5 C's were embedded in these essential skills. Essential questions. Driving questions help teachers in developing rich lessons in computing and related content areas. Essential vocabulary. Key terms for teachers are identified to clarify definitions and ensure teacher understanding when instructing students. A sample standard from first grade can be seen here. This standard pertains to revising created work, or debugging as we would call it, which can be applied in multiple different content areas. This section provides a description of the intent of debugging, as well as some instructions and suggestions for how a sequence or algorithm could be debugged. Students are not expected to practice formal debugging techniques, but rather they should articulate the need for debugging and perform some basic revision strategies. An example of the curriculum framework with outlined elements is seen to accompany with Standard 1.3. You see we have essential skills with the performance expectations, essential questions to drive instruction, and essential vocabulary for the teachers. I would like to point out that at these low grade levels, the heading for the essential vocabulary reflects an introduction to new concepts rather than at higher grade levels, they are application within context. You see the essential vocabulary section has the terms and grade level appropriate definitions are included in a separate glossary for each grade. In order to let our stakeholders have the opportunity to respond to the Computer Science Curriculum Framework draft, we have several opportunities for public comment. These include an online feedback platform and webinars to explain the curriculum framework's development and to elicit feedback. In addition to a superintendent's memo announcing public comment opportunities, all computer science and division leaders, contacts at institutes of higher education, and teachers will be notified through our existing communication platforms of these opportunities for public comment. Our planned next steps include the following: advertising this opportunity for public comment, revising the 2017 computer science curriculum framework based on comments received, providing professional development on the standards and the curriculum framework, constructing instructional support materials and ancillary documents to further support the framework, and creating a web-based enhanced curriculum framework. Our intention is to add components such as instructional support and resources and explicit cross-curricular connections within this enhanced curriculum framework. Thank you for allowing me the chance to provide a brief explanation to the proposed Computer Science Standards of Learning Curriculum Framework. It is the superintendent's recommendation to receive this framework for first review, and I'd like to take the opportunity to invite questions from the board concerning these proposed documents.
Okay, members of the board, are there any questions? Yeah, please, Dr. Duran.
Just a comment. We just want to thank you for this work. It's exciting work to see, particularly the integration at the elementary level, and not the standalone prior of computer science being taught as a separate course. So I really love that. That has been a major driver, it appears, through K-8 in the content. And I look forward to the comments that we might hear and the professional development to come. So no comment, no questions, just a comment. Well, thanking you.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Yes.
I would like to thank you also for the vertical alignment of the blooms for the younger children through elementary. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, Ms. Atkins.
Is there a reason why solicitation of feedback from the public is web-based versus the traditional, going into certain regions and opening it up for discussion?
Some other subjects within my office have tried out this virtual feedback platform and found that there is greater participation among teachers and the public having them online rather than having to go and what can be, speaking to an empty room sometimes.
Yep. We've done the empty room thing once or twice. So I'm certainly glad that you share Dr. Peterson's enthusiasm for the subject. I will say everybody from the science wing who presents has that same level of excitement, which is actually refreshing to see. So thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Nope. If that's it, thank you so much.
All right.
And the board accepts that on first review. Okay, we have a report written in the materials you have, and then discussion of current events. Is there anything board members would like to discuss, or Dr. Lane?
So just a comment.
Yes, please.
Over the last 3 or 4 weeks or so, I've had the opportunity to participate in a couple of summits, and I just wanted to acknowledge my participation alongside division leaders, including Dr. Duran. On July 9th, the Equity Summit presented by the department, well-attended conference overall. Kudos to the department, Leah Walker and others, Monica Smith-Callahan for pulling all of that together and all of that work. I also, and at that conference, I moderated a panel, actually. And then I moderated a panel for the Richmond Chamber of Commerce, an education summit, actually their inaugural, where I had the opportunity to sit alongside Secretary Atif Carney and Superintendent James Lane to talk about how our work as a board is affecting and supports the efforts of the Commonwealth for driving economic and workforce development. So I appreciate those opportunities and wanted to acknowledge those two items with the board.
Anybody else? Dr. Duran?
Just want to reiterate that and thank the department, Dr. Lane, Leah Walker, and all who went into putting on a really phenomenal Virginia for All Education, Equity Education Learners Summit. We had some amazing speakers, Howard University professor from BET, Congressman Scott, and just it was wonderful to be in the room and hear the buzz around the amount of equity and the work that we're doing. And I think the part that, aside from what was already been shared by Dr. Wilson, was the opportunity to share, because many of the breakout sessions allowed for us to get into small groups and share with one another about the work. And there's some great work happening across the Commonwealth. And we also realize there's a lot more work to be done and how we can all join forces in that work. So thank you, Dr. Lane. Thank you, Leah Walker, again, for a phenomenal job.
Anybody else? If not, I guess we will adjourn. I hope, Ms. Vaught, that you have not been scared off and you'll be back next month or in September. Actually, we ought to have all 9 in September, so we're looking forward to that. So thank you all so much, and we'll see you then. We are adjourned.